Hey everyone, it's Beverly Hallberg. Welcome to a special pop-up episode of She Thinks, your favorite podcast from the Independent Women's Forum, where we talk with women and sometimes men about the policy issues that impact you and the people you care about most. Enjoy.
Hello. My name is Patrice Onwuka. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. February is Black History Month, a time when we reflect on the achievements of Blacks in America. Our guest today is Mr. Robert Woodson, founder and president of the Woodson Center. This organization has helped residents of low-income neighborhoods address the problems of their communities for over 30 years. Mr. Woodson is a former civil rights activist. He has headed the National Urban League Department of Criminal Justice and been a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Foundation for Public Policy Research. Mr. Woodson, it is a pleasure to have you on the She Thinks podcast.
I'm pleased to be here.
Terrific. Well, sir, you have quite a background. Please tell us your story and why you think it resonates with so many young people.
Well, I'm a veteran of the civil rights movement, but I became really disenchanted with the movement and left the movement in the mid-'60s following the death of Dr. King, because I differed with the leadership on issues of forced busing for integration. I believe that was a wrong strategy, that the opposite of segregation is not integration, is desegregation. Because if you conclude that anything is all black is all bad, then that's self-defeating. But I also left the movement when I realized that a lot of people who suffered and sacrificed didn't benefit from the change, and that I saw there was huge class differences, that we were using the demographics of low-income blacks to make our case for remedies, and when the remedies arrived, they benefited the well-educated and upper-income blacks. And so this is a flaw that I think has adversely affected our ability to fight poverty in America for the last 50 years. And so I left the movement when I realized, as Dr. King said, what good does it do to have the right to eat in a restaurant of your choice or live in a neighborhood of your choosing if you don't have the economic means to exercise that right? So I've since then have worked on behalf of low-income people of all races to help them to develop the capacity to both open the doors of opportunity, but also be prepared to walk through those opportunities. And so that has defined me for many years. My course is helping low-income people of all. I don't believe racism is the biggest problem we're facing today. It's elitism is the biggest barrier to the poor getting ahead.
You have hit something that I've observed quite often with a lot of the solutions we're seeing, even, for example, student loan forgiveness, which is it's advertised as helping people with low-income people with college degrees or even college dropouts, but really it would benefit those who are upper-income earners. And I think you've hit something really interesting, which is the elitism that so many solutions to poverty actually don't really address. I mean, I'm curious. We saw in 2019 that the poverty rates for minorities fell to their lowest recorded levels. And for blacks, that was below 20% for the first time in history. And, I attribute it to a strong jobs market. Do you think that what do you attribute the falling of poverty rates to? And, you have those lawmakers who say, well, we actually need more money, more federal money in anti-poverty programs. Do you agree with that as well?
No, we do not. We don't need more money in anti-poverty programs. When we create a vigorous job market, it is the best anti-poverty fighter in the world is to have a good job market. Tom Sowell documents the fact that the biggest drop in poverty occurred between 1940 and 1960. when we had like 82% in 1940 down to 45% in 1950, and then another 18%. And then when the government started its $22 trillion, 5-decade-old poverty programs, where 70 cents for every dollar that we spent on poverty did not go to the poor. It went to those who serve poor people, and they ask which problems are fundable, not which ones are solvable. So we really created a commodity out of poor people, and as a consequence of that, the poverty level has flattened out for almost 50 years until this 2019, because we have created perverse incentives for people to be independent and self-sufficient. And now all of this emphasis on government, increased government intervention and so-called institutional racism, it is the worst combination of circumstances that I can imagine that really threatens the well-being of particularly low-income blacks.
Well, thank you for jumping right to where we're at today, the social justice movement of today. Just overall, do you think that what we're seeing today, the Black Lives Matters movement and the organization itself, does it have any resemblance to the civil rights movement that you saw back in the 50s and 60s, and that you were a part of?
It's just the inverse of it. The civil rights movement was fighting for inclusion. It also, we wanted to be judged by our character, not the color of our skin. The Black Lives Matter is just the inverse of that. They want everything to be judged by the color of our skin. They also want government to come in and fix every problem they want. They're also hostile to the very virtues and values that enabled Black Americans to survive slavery and Jim Crow. And that is, they are hostile to the nuclear family. They say that it's Eurocentric and therefore racist. They're hostile to Christian faith, which is another value that enabled Black to survive. The nuclear family and self-determination, all of those are antithetical to the civil rights movement. But I think the Black Lives Matter movement has really hijacked the civil rights movement and weaponized race. I don't think they care about the welfare of Black people. If they did, they wouldn't be burning down their businesses. And
I 100% agree with you. What I found frustrating is hearing, when watching the looting and the burning and the rioting, and then hearing from members of Congress excuse that behavior, particularly the looting, excusing it as, well, people need to eat, and that's what they're feeding themselves. Do you buy that argument that poor people turn to looting and rioting because of poverty?
That's poverty up until 1960 has never been linked to aberrant behavior. Otherwise, we would have sharecroppers rioting in the 20s and 30s. But I can't recall sharecroppers robbing banks or looting stores just because they're poor. That's just a misnomer. In fact, part of our studies in 1776, we looked at the 1930 to 1940 when racism was enshrined in law, and the unemployment rate in the Black community was 40%. Elderly people could walk safely in that community without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. And we had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. And it was our Christian faith and our commitment to family that shielded us from the horrors of Jim Crow. So how can you conclude if even during the Depression we didn't rob and steal and kill each other the way we are today? So how can you make a claim that poverty is the root cause of some of this behavior we're witnessing?
I think you're 100% right. Now, you brought up 1776. Please talk about that initiative and also the initiative you're launching regarding moms who have lost their children to violence and are speaking out.
Well, 1776, we are celebrating our first year anniversary on the 18th of February. And that's when a group of 23 scholars and activists got together and decided we were going to respond to 1619. This was a project of the New York Times Magazine section. Nicole Hannah-Jones and other Black journalists got together and wrote, wanted to redefine America's birth date as 1619, when the first 20 African slaves arrived on our shore. And they concluded in their essays that America is incurably racist and that capitalism was the outcome of a slaveocracy, and therefore America is to be forever condemned and defined by slavery. And therefore all white people are complicit and to be punished, and all Black people are victims to be compensated. And so we decided that we would respond not with a counter argument, but with a counter inspirational and aspirational narrative. And so we have essays that refute the fundamental premise of 1619, that slavery and the legacy of slavery is responsible for some of the pathology that we're seeing today. We have evidence that when white people were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. In Chicago, for example, in 1929, there were 731 Black-owned businesses and $100 million in real estate assets that Black owned during segregation. And this is true all over the country. There were small Wall Streets all over the country. When we were denied access to hotels, we built our own. The Wallahaji in Atlanta, the Carver and Calvert hotels in Miami, the St. Charles in Chicago, the St. Teresa in New York. I could go on and on and on. We built our own medical schools. We even had our own railroad that operated from Baltimore in 1868. We had our own railroad. When 1,000 Blacks were fired, we collected our own capital and financed a railroad that successfully ran from Baltimore to Maine. And so we have a rich history of entrepreneurship and resilience that our young people it's being kept from our young people. And instead, all of what the radical left is doing is preaching of victimization, and that it's somehow that because of our racial past, that Blacks today exempt from any personal responsibility for their own uplift. That's what we're challenging.
Well, I love that, and I love you just talked about personal agency and the fact that we as individuals, have choice, have freedom, and have the ability to make decisions for ourselves. And it seems like those values, in addition to family, in addition to community, are values that you promote through the Woodson Center. But just returning to one other topic, I've been surprised. I live right outside of D.C. We're seeing carjackings again. Haven't seen that since the 80s, I believe. And we're across so many cities, we're seeing this resurgence in violent crime, and crime and violence overall. Talk to me. Why do you think we're seeing such a resurgence in violence? And what can we do about it? What is your organization doing about it?
I think that the upsurge in violence is directly related to the vilification of the police department. I think there's a direct correlation when the radical left has started its assault on the policing and calling for defunding the police. The police, as a consequence, engage in what I call nullification. They decide if they're going to be accused of racism, they won't patrol those high crime areas as aggressively as they would have. And as a consequence, from Freddie Gray in Baltimore 10 years ago, you've seen a decline in aggressive policing in those communities and a rise in murder rates to the point now where recruitment of police officers around the country is down 62%. Many of them are retiring and they're not being replaced. And in some cities, it takes 30 minutes for the police to respond to a 911 call. But the people who are advocating defund the police don't have to live with the consequence of what they're advocating, because the crime isn't happening where they live. And what we're doing at the Woodson Center, frankly, is we are working with a group of Black mothers, 2,500 of them, who have lost children to violence, and they're coming together, and they want to give voice to say that we are against defunding the police. They're also working with the prosecutors and working with the homicide detectives when a murder occurs, by actually serving as a liaison between the police department and the families. And as a consequence, more trust is built and more cases are being closed.
That is an excellent example of community engagement with police and helping to restore the trust. I think that you've seen loss between police and communities, in part because, as you rightly said, this anti-police rhetoric has been devastating. I'd love to wrap up our discussion today, just asking, as we look forward, what are one or two policies that you would like to see implemented, whether that's the federal level or for states to consider, that you think will really uplift poor communities and help those Americans who are still struggling to achieve that economic mobility and that American dream?
I'm not so sure it's another policy we need. We just need to look for remedies where the problem is. We need to stop the hustle right now, because Black Lives Matter is raising millions of dollars to address systemic racism that's supposed to be the cause of the decline in these cities. The National Football League pledged $250 million to address, quote, systemic racism. I don't know what that is, but I really think that private corporations should stop allowing themselves to be cheated by Black Lives Matter. We ought to be investing not in esoteric training of middle-class blacks, giving race grievance training to guilty white people. Instead, that money should be invested with these mothers and other community-based programs that are solving the problem. The leading cause of death of young black men is other young black men. There's nothing that institutional racism can do to stop that. That is an internal problem that has to be addressed. The enemy is in the black community, and that's where the solution has to be supported.
Sir, you have so well articulated what I certainly believe. I'm a mom of 3 black boys, including 2 babies, and this is what I'm teaching them. I'm teaching them about personal responsibility, about agency, about looking out for their own community. And I think that we need more of the types of community-based programs that you are working on today. So thank you so much for your time, Mr. Woodson, and your thoughts for sharing your thoughts with our listeners today. And I'm just going to plug, for a fascinating read, I recommend that listeners check out your recent co-authored op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. It's entitled, How the Left Hijacked Civil Rights. So, sir, thank you for joining us. And listeners, we thank you for listening in to the She Thinks podcast today.